He woke up before the sun like he did every morning. The small apartment was quiet except for the soft hum of the heater and the distant sound of traffic outside. He moved slowly, careful not to wake the little boy sleeping in the next room. Raising a child alone was not easy, but he had promised himself long ago that he would do everything he could to make sure his son felt safe, loved, and proud of him. He wasn't rich. He didn't have a fancy job or a life full of excitement, but he had determination, and he had dreams that he had never let go of, even if the world seemed to have forgotten them after a quick breakfast of toast and eggs. He kissed his son on the forehead and whispered a promise. "I'll see you tonight, buddy. Don't worry, everything's going to be okay." The boy mumbled something in his sleep and rolled over, and he quietly left for work. His janitor's uniform hung loosely on his thin frame. It was worn from years of labor, but it was clean, and that mattered. Every day he pushed a mop, emptied trash cans, and made sure the community hall was ready for the people who came through its doors. Most people didn't notice him. Some nodded politely, some avoided eye contact, and some he knew looked down on him. But he didn't care. He did his work quietly and without complaint, taking pride in the small things, the shine on a polished floor, the neatness of a cleaned room, the faint smell of soap in the air after a long day. He had worked at that hall for years, longer than anyone remembered. In all that time, he had never missed a shift, never complained, and never asked for anything. But no matter how hard he worked, he was always just the janitor to the people around him. No one asked about his life, his dreams, or the struggles he faced every day. They only saw what they wanted, a man who swept floors and moved furniture. Someone invisible in plain sight. But today was different. Today, there was an announcement posted on the bulletin board of the hall. A talent show was coming, something to celebrate local people and give them a chance to perform. He had heard about it weeks ago from a flyer a visitor left behind. But at first, he had laughed at the thought of participating. Who would take a janitor seriously? Who would believe he had talent? But a little voice inside him whispered that maybe, just maybe, it was time to try. And so he had signed up quietly, without telling anyone. As he walked through the hall, broom in hand, he glanced at the stage. The bright lights gleamed even in the empty room, casting long shadows across the polished floor. The seats were empty now, but he imagined what it would be like later, filled with people waiting to be entertained. Most of them would see him and laugh, he thought. They wouldn't take him seriously. But he also knew something they didn't, that he had been practicing for years. Late at night, after his son had gone to sleep, he would sit at the old piano in the corner of his apartment, fingers moving over the keys, music filling the silent room. No one ever heard him play. No one ever knew the hours he spent perfecting every note, the sweat, the frustration, the quiet tears when he made mistakes. Music was his secret world, his escape, and his way of telling the story of his life when words weren't enough. He remembered the first time he touched a piano. He was a teenager then, curious and eager, desperate for something beautiful to fill the emptiness in his life. At first, it was clumsy. His fingers stumbled and the sounds were rough and unpolished. But he didn't give up. Every spare moment he practiced. Every coin he earned from odd jobs went toward books, sheet music, or piano lessons whenever he could afford them. Life had been difficult, but music had always been there, constant and comforting. Even now, after years of cleaning floors and emptying trash cans, the piano remained a lifeline. Some people might think it strange for a man like him to have such a passion, to dream so boldly, but he had learned long ago that dreams are what keep a person alive inside. They are what give a man hope when the world treats him like he is invisible. And today, he had a chance to show just a small piece of that world to others. Even if only for a few minutes, he went about his morning chores as usual. He swept the floors with careful precision, wiped down the windows, and rearranged chairs in neat rows. His movements were automatic, trained over years of repetition, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought about the stage, the bright lights, the audience that would soon fill the room. He imagined their laughter, their whispers, their doubt. And he imagined himself sitting at the piano, fingers poised over the keys, Ready to silence all of it. By midday, the hall was buzzing with preparations. The talent show would start in a few hours, and volunteers moved around with clipboards and microphones. He stayed mostly in the background, sweeping quietly, unnoticed. That was fine. He didn't need anyone to cheer for him now. All that mattered was being ready. He took a moment to sit on a bench near the stage, letting his eyes wander over the shiny floorboards and the curtains that would soon part. In his mind, he ran through every note, every chord, every movement he would make. He had rehearsed this countless times alone, but performing in front of strangers was different. It made his heart race and his palms sweat, but he pushed the nerves aside. This was bigger than fear. This was about proving to himself and maybe to his son that he was more than what people thought. As the afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows, casting golden light across the hall, he noticed a few people setting up chairs in the audience. Some glanced at him curiously, others whispered to one another. He could hear the faint laughter of a group of teenagers as they noticed him wiping the stage floor. It wasn't malicious, just casual, but it stung all the same. He straightened his back, took a deep breath, and reminded himself why he was here. He wasn't seeking approval from strangers. He was here to show the world a piece of himself he had never shared, to let his music speak when words would fail. Hours passed quickly. Soon, the hall was filled with people. Families, friends, and locals crowded the seats. Cameras flashed, and the host welcomed everyone with an enthusiastic introduction. He stayed backstage, adjusting his tie, wiping his sweaty hands on his pants, and peeking at the audience from behind the curtain. He could hear the laughter and chatter, the jokes made at the expense of performers before him. Some were clumsy, some were funny, and some were surprisingly good. But he reminded himself that none of it mattered. This was his moment, and he was ready. When his name was called, he felt a knot in his stomach. The audience turned to look, some with polite curiosity, others with barely hidden amusement. He stepped onto the stage slowly, letting the lights warm his face, letting the eyes of strangers fall upon him. He could feel the judgment, the assumptions, the disbelief. And yet, for the first time in a long time, he felt calm. He walked to the piano at the center of the stage, his fingers hovering over the keys, and took one last deep breath. No one knew what to expect. Most assumed this would be a brief, awkward performance, a little comic relief in the middle of a serious talent show. But he had learned long ago that appearances can be deceiving. And as he lowered himself onto the piano bench, closed his eyes for just a moment, and let his fingers touch the keys, the hall held its collective breath without realizing it. In that simple moment, the janitor, the single father, the quiet man who had spent his life unseen, began to play. The moment he pressed the first keys, there was a pause in the room. Not a single sound came from the audience, just a low, almost invisible hum of curiosity. They had expected someone awkward or unskilled, maybe even a short, funny attempt. But what they heard instead was something completely different. The music was soft at first, delicate, like someone telling a secret too precious to be shouted. Every note seemed to float in the air, wrapping around the audience, pulling them in slowly. Some people shifted in their seats, unsure what to make of it. A few leaned forward, eyebrows raised, whispering to the person next to them. "Is he really playing that?" Someone muttered. There was disbelief, and behind that, a spark of curiosity that no one had expected to feel. They had laughed quietly when his name was announced, assumed it would be a joke, but already, in the first few seconds, their assumptions were crumbling. He didn't notice the audience. He never did. His mind was elsewhere. Every note he played carried years of struggle, sacrifice, and hope. Every chord told a story of late nights in a small apartment, practicing while the world slept. Every movement of his fingers expressed emotions he had never shared with anyone, not even his son, who sometimes peeked into the living room to watch him play quietly. Music had been his voice when life had left him without words. And tonight he poured that voice into the room, letting it reach everyone who thought they could judge him. The laughter that had been in the air was gone. The whispers stopped. Even the teenagers who had made jokes earlier now sat straight, their eyes fixed on him. It was as if the room itself had leaned closer, eager to listen. Some people felt chills run down their spines, not knowing why. Others felt tears prick their eyes, though they tried to blink them back. There was something honest and raw in the way he played, something real that touched hearts in ways words could not. He closed his eyes, letting his memory guide his fingers. He thought of the mornings when his son had clutched a small toy in his hand and smiled sleepily, of the nights when he had sat alone at the piano, frustrated, tired, but refusing to give up. He thought of all the times he had been overlooked, ignored, dismissed because of the uniform he wore or the job he did, and he played for all of it. Every note was a declaration. He was more than what they saw. More than the label the world had given him. Some of the judges leaned forward, eyebrows knitted, trying to understand what they were hearing. They had seen many talented performers before, but something about this was different. There was a depth, a life, and a story embedded in every chord. It wasn't just technical skill, it was feeling, passion, and truth. And in a room full of people who had expected comedy or awkwardness, that truth hit like a wave. The audience could no longer hide their reactions. A few couples held hands tightly, as if the music itself demanded closeness. An older man in the back sat with his mouth slightly open, a tear escaping down his cheek. A young girl whispered to her friend, "He's amazing," unable to contain her excitement. People who had arrived ready to laugh now sat in awe, captivated by someone they had underestimated. The janitor, the single father, the man everyone had thought of as ordinary, didn't stop. He didn't glance at the audience or check the judges' faces. He simply let the music flow, letting every note tell a story of life, struggle, and perseverance. Each chord grew stronger, more confident, more commanding. The music began to fill the corners of the hall, echoing off the walls, capturing every heart in the room, and then came the part where the music seemed to speak louder than ever. Fast, intricate sequences that would have seemed impossible from someone they thought they knew. His fingers moved with precision, with grace, with something that seemed effortless but was, in truth, the result of years of hidden effort. The audience gasped, a sound that spread like wildfire. Some leaned forward in shock, unable to believe what their eyes and ears were seeing. Others exchanged glances of regret, realizing they had judged someone too quickly. A few people whispered apologies to one another. "I didn't think he could do this," one person admitted softly. "Neither did I," another replied, shaking their head in disbelief. But there was no time for words now. The music had taken over. It demanded attention, respect, and awe. And slowly, silently, the entire room was giving it all three. The host, who had been trying to maintain composure, glanced at the judges with wide eyes. He had never seen a reaction like this before in all his years hosting events. Even the most cynical of the judges sat in stunned silence, unsure how to score someone who had completely shattered every expectation. And yet, the most important reaction was not theirs. It was the one that came from the heart of the audience. Ordinary people, like the man himself who had come to see entertainment or to pass time, were now witnessing something extraordinary. And in that moment, the janitor didn't feel nervous. He didn't feel judged or small. He felt alive. He felt free. The music was no longer a secret locked away in a tiny apartment. It was here, filling the hall, touching strangers, proving that talent could live anywhere, even in someone who cleaned floors and moved chairs. Someone who the world had long forgotten to notice. Time seemed to stretch as he played. The minutes melted together, but every second was meaningful. There was a rhythm, a rise and fall, that captured emotions no one had expected. He played with joy, with sorrow, with hope, with pride. And as the last notes lingered in the air, he slowly lifted his hands from the keys. For a brief, almost surreal moment, there was silence. Absolute silence. Then it happened. One clap, tentative at first, almost as if the person was testing the sound. Then another and another until the entire hall erupted in applause. People stood from their seats, cheering, some wiping tears from their eyes. They had laughed before, yes, but now they were shouting, clapping, whistling, giving respect to someone who had quietly carried a world of talent and emotion inside him. The single father, still seated at the piano, took a deep breath. His chest was heavy, his fingers tingling from the performance, but he smiled. He didn't need the applause. Not really. But seeing it, feeling it, knowing that people finally understood, even for a moment, made every sacrifice worthwhile. For the first time in a long time, he felt seen. Truly seen. Not for the uniform, not for the title, not for the job, but for him who he was, what he had endured, and the beauty he carried inside. People around him were talking all at once. Some were congratulating him, others were shaking their heads in disbelief, still processing what had just happened. A young woman whispered, "I judged him so wrong." "I feel terrible." An older man laughed nervously. "I would never have guessed." And the janitor, the single father, just nodded quietly, letting the music speak for him, letting the moment sink in. He remembered his son waiting at home, probably wondering if his dad had done okay. He imagined the boy's proud smile, the wide eyes, and the quiet hug he would give when he returned. The thought gave him warmth, stronger than any applause, stronger than any recognition. It was the real reason he played, the real reason he had signed up for the talent show. Not to prove anything to strangers, but to show his son that even when life was hard, even when the world didn't see you, you could rise. You could shine. You could be more than what people expected, and in that moment, as the audience continued to cheer, he knew that his life had changed. Maybe not in a way that would make him rich or famous, but in a way that mattered far more. He had shown courage, he had shown talent, and he had reminded everyone in that hall that no one should be underestimated. No one should be judged by appearances or job titles. The music had started as a whisper and ended as a roar, and it had left the room transformed. People would talk about this performance for weeks, maybe months, telling their friends, their families, anyone who would listen. And he, the quiet janitor, the devoted father, would return home, carrying something even more precious than applause, pride, dignity, and the knowledge that sometimes the greatest surprises come from the most unexpected places. The room had gone quiet after the last note lingered in the air. For a moment, it felt like the world had stopped, holding its breath. People who had come expecting light entertainment, a bit of fun, or even a laugh, now sat in stunned silence. Their minds were struggling to catch up with what they had just witnessed. They had assumed they knew who this man was, what he could do, and now, everything they thought was wrong. He wasn't just a janitor. He wasn't just a man who swept floors and emptied trash cans. He was something else entirely. Something extraordinary. The applause had started small, but even as it grew louder, some people remained frozen. They didn't know how to react. Some mouths were open in disbelief. Some eyes were wide, reflecting awe and regret. They had mocked him in their heads, had laughed quietly at the thought of a funny performance. And now, in the span of a few minutes, their assumptions had been completely shattered. Every person in that hall was thinking the same thing. They had judged too soon. He sat there at the piano, hands resting lightly on the keys. He wasn't playing anymore. He didn't need to. The music itself had said everything he wanted it to. But the silence that followed was powerful. It wasn't just the lack of sound, it was the realization, the acknowledgement that this quiet, unassuming man carried a world inside him that no one had taken the time to see. It was humbling, even for those who had thought themselves better or smarter than him. A few people in the audience leaned forward, whispering to one another, "Did he really do that? I can't believe it. He's incredible." Their words were soft, almost reverent, as if speaking louder might shatter the magic that had just happened. They weren't just praising skill, they were marveling at the courage it had taken to step on that stage in the first place, to go out there knowing the world might laugh, to expose your heart and your talent despite the risk of embarrassment. That was bravery few could understand. The judges, who had been careful not to reveal their emotions, now exchanged glances. They had seen countless performers over the years, but few had moved them like this. There was technical skill, yes, but more than that, there was emotion, there was depth, there was honesty. His playing didn't just fill the hall with sound, it filled it with feeling. They could see the story behind every note, the sacrifices, the struggles, the quiet life lived in the shadows. And suddenly the numbers and scores that mattered in a competition seemed trivial. This was more than a performance, it was a moment that demanded respect. Meanwhile, he remained calm, almost serene. His eyes scanned the audience briefly, noticing their reactions. The surprise, the disbelief, the growing admiration, it all seemed distant, like watching through a foggy window. He had played for himself. He had played for his son, for the quiet years of practice in his small apartment. For every night he had gone to bed tired, unsure if he would ever be seen or heard. And now, as he looked at the faces before him, he understood something important. Recognition was fleeting, but the courage to share your gift that was lasting. The people who had once laughed quietly now whispered apologies to one another. A group of teenagers nudged each other awkwardly, their earlier smirks gone. "I can't believe we thought he was a joke," one muttered, staring at him in awe. A woman in the front row, who had been ready to giggle at the situation, now sat with tears in her eyes. "He deserves so much more than we realized," she whispered softly, her voice shaking. The room had shifted. What had been amusement had turned into admiration. What had been doubt had turned into respect. He didn't need anyone's approval. Yet the warmth of their acknowledgement was undeniable. It was proof that no matter how invisible a person might seem, the truth of who they are can shine through when they take a risk. That was the real magic of this moment. The applause, the admiration, the astonishment, they were all just reflections of something that had always been inside him, waiting for a chance to be seen. As the host finally stepped forward, the applause continued. He tried to speak, to fill the silence with words, but even his practiced introduction seemed small compared to what had just happened. "Ladies and gentlemen," he faltered, searching for the words. The audience was still cheering, clapping, some standing now, their eyes fixed on the man at the piano. It was one of those rare moments when words failed completely. People began to stand in small groups, talking excitedly, pointing toward him, trying to process the performance. The energy in the hall was electric, alive. There was laughter now, but not mocking laughter. It was the kind of laughter that comes from being moved, from realizing you underestimated someone, from finally seeing the truth. "He's amazing," someone said. "I never expected that from him." "Neither did I," another replied, shaking their head in disbelief. "He's incredible." And through it all, he stayed seated, letting the moment wash over him quietly. He didn't need the praise. He didn't need the recognition. But he appreciated it, yes, because for the first time, people weren't seeing the uniform or the janitor's job, they were seeing him. The man who had spent years nurturing his talent in secret, who had faced judgment silently every day, who had carried both responsibility and dreams in the same heart. They were seeing the person behind the work clothes, and that mattered more than anything else. Backstage, a few volunteers and helpers whispered among themselves. They had seen him countless times sweeping floors, tidying up, moving furniture, invisible in the corners. And now, seeing him like this, they felt a quiet respect, a newfound understanding. "All these years and we never knew," one said softly. "I never imagined," another admitted. It was as if the hall itself had changed. The way people looked at him had changed. The way they felt about assumptions had changed. He stood slowly after a few moments, letting the audience continue their applause. He bowed politely, humble, grateful, but not overwhelmed. He didn't want to appear dramatic. This wasn't about vanity. It was about truth. He had shared a part of himself, and that was enough. The applause, the awe, the astonishment, they were just echoes of something much deeper, the recognition that sometimes the greatest talent can live in the most unexpected places. Even as the audience settled into a quieter, reflective mood, whispers continued. People were still shaking their heads in disbelief, still murmuring to one another about how wrong they had been. They had judged him based on appearances, based on a uniform, based on the work he did every day. And now, they understood how foolish that judgment had been. They had learned something important. Never assume you know the depth of a person's abilities. Never underestimate someone because of what you see on the surface. In that moment, he thought of his son again. He imagined him at home, probably pacing the living room, waiting for his father to call, eager to hear what happened. He could almost see the wide smile, the bright eyes, the quiet hug that would follow. That thought brought warmth to his chest, stronger than any applause. He had done this for himself, yes, but also for the boy who depended on him, who believed in him even when others didn't. He had shown his son that courage and perseverance could break through any barrier, even when the world doubted you. And as he walked off the stage, the hall still buzzing with energy, he felt something shift inside him. A weight he had carried for years, the weight of invisibility, of being overlooked, of being judged too quickly, had lifted. He hadn't just played music. He had told his story without words. He had shown the world a piece of himself that had always been hidden. And for the first time, he felt truly recognized, not for what he did, but for who he was. People continued to talk long after he left the stage. The audience was inspired, moved, and humbled. Some admitted quietly to themselves how wrong they had been. Others vowed silently to never judge anyone so quickly again. The hall had become more than just a place for a talent show. It had become a space where assumptions were challenged, where humility and admiration coexisted, and where a single man could change the hearts of dozens of strangers with nothing more than the gift he had carried inside him all along. And the man, the janitor, the single father, walked back to the quiet corners of the hall, collecting his coat and bag. He wasn't thinking about fame or fortune. He wasn't thinking about applause or recognition. He was thinking about his son, about the small life they were building together, about the quiet courage it had taken to step on that stage. And as he stepped outside into the evening air, the lights of the hall behind him still glowing, he felt lighter than he had in years. He had faced judgment, he had faced doubt, and he had emerged not just victorious but understood. And that, he knew, was more than enough. After he stepped away from the piano, the room seemed to hum with energy. The applause had stopped, but the audience was still buzzing, talking in low voices, pointing toward him as if he were a marvel they could hardly believe existed. People were shaking their heads, murmuring to one another about how wrong they had been. They had laughed at the idea of him performing, assuming he would be awkward or unskilled, and now they could only stare in astonishment. It was a transformation, not just in their perception of him, but in the way the room itself felt. He walked slowly through the hall, collecting his coat and bag. Volunteers and organizers came over to congratulate him, but he smiled politely, nodding quietly. He didn't want to make a scene. He didn't need to. The applause, the awe, the whispers of admiration, those were enough. Even strangers who had never spoken to him before now looked at him differently. They were beginning to understand that appearances could be misleading, that the quiet man who swept floors and emptied trash cans carried talent, courage and heart far beyond what anyone had imagined. The judges, who had been stunned moments earlier, now moved toward him. One of them, an older woman with a notebook in her hand, hesitated before speaking. I have never seen anything like that," she said softly, her eyes still wide. "Your skill, your emotion, it's remarkable. Truly remarkable." Another judge, a man known for being critical and difficult to impress, simply shook his head in disbelief. "I underestimated you," he admitted, his voice low but sincere. "Completely. You're incredible." He nodded again, keeping his focus calm, almost detached, but inside a quiet pride was growing. He had never performed for recognition, never played to impress strangers. He had done it for himself, for his son, and for the love of music. But hearing people acknowledge the truth he had carried inside for so long, it warmed him in a way that was hard to describe. After years of being invisible, of being dismissed because of his job and his humble life, he was finally being seen. Truly seen. As he made his way through the crowd, people reached out to shake his hand or pat him on the back. "That was incredible," one person said. "I never would have guessed." Another whispered. Children looked at him with wide eyes, some mimicking the gestures they had seen at the piano, fingers moving as if they were playing along. Even the teenagers who had laughed quietly earlier now stood awkwardly, unable to hide their admiration. The atmosphere had shifted completely. What had begun as mockery had turned into respect, astonishment. and even a bit of humility, he paused near the side of the hall, letting a group of people pass by. A young woman who had been in the audience all evening stopped and said, "I'm sorry for thinking you wouldn't be good. I never imagined you could play like that." He smiled gently and nodded, understanding more than words could express. "It's okay," he said simply. "We all have our assumptions. The important thing is to try, even if people don't believe in you." The applause had started again, this time from different parts of the hall. People were clapping in small groups, still talking quietly, their voices filled with excitement and wonder. The host, who had seemed unsure moments before, returned to the stage with a microphone in hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, "what you just witnessed was not just a performance. It was a reminder that talent and courage can exist in places we least expect. Please give him one more round of applause." The crowd responded immediately, cheering louder than before, some standing in admiration, others wiping tears from their eyes. Backstage, the organizers were busy taking notes, talking to one another, and trying to process what had just happened. They had hosted talent shows for years, but something about this performance felt different. It wasn't just about skill, it was about heart, about the story behind the music, about the quiet strength of a man who had faced life alone and never given up. They realized that what they had witnessed was not just entertainment, but an example of resilience, courage, and the hidden potential that exists in ordinary people. As the evening went on, more people approached him. Some offered congratulations, others simply wanted to shake his hand or ask questions about how he had learned to play. He answered politely, sharing only small pieces of his story. He didn't need to talk much. His music had already spoken louder than words ever could. But seeing the way people reacted, the way they were moved, filled him with a quiet satisfaction. For the first time, he felt that his life, his sacrifices, and his dedication had been acknowledged in a way that mattered. The hall began to empty slowly, and the evening drew to a close. People lingered, still discussing the performance in hushed, reverent tones. He took a moment to look around, seeing the expressions on faces still filled with wonder. He realized that something inside the audience had shifted that night. Their perceptions, their judgments, and perhaps even their hearts had been changed by the honesty and beauty of his music. He had become more than the job he did or the uniform he wore. He had become a symbol of hope, of talent, and of the quiet strength that exists in those who are often overlooked. He stepped outside into the cool night air, taking a deep breath. The city lights twinkled in the distance, and he thought of his son waiting at home. He imagined the excitement in the boy's eyes, the hug he would receive, the pride he would feel. That thought alone made every moment worth it. The applause, the admiration, the astonishment, those were wonderful. Yes, but the real reward was the knowledge that he had shown his son that perseverance, courage, and talent can break through even the toughest barriers on the way home. He walked slowly, savoring the quiet satisfaction of the evening. He passed familiar streets, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. People he had known for years might not have recognized him in a different light, but tonight he felt different. He carried a sense of accomplishment that no one could take away. A feeling of pride that came from proving, if only to himself, that he was capable of extraordinary things. When he entered his small apartment, he was greeted by the warm smell of dinner and the sight of his son playing quietly with a toy on the floor. The boy looked up, eyes bright, and ran to his father. "Did you do it, Dad?" he asked, voice full of anticipation. He lifted him into his arms, holding him close. "Yes, buddy," he said softly, smiling. "I did it." And in that moment, the applause in his mind was louder than anything in the hall. His son's pride and love were worth more than all the cheers, all the recognition, and all the admiration of strangers. As they sat down for dinner together, he shared a little of what had happened, careful not to overwhelm his son with details. But the excitement in the boy's eyes mirrored his own, a mixture of pride, joy, and awe. He realized then that this evening had been about more than just a performance. It had been about showing his son that dedication and courage are more important than appearances, and that dreams, no matter how hidden, can come to life when you have the courage to share them. Later that night, as he tucked his son into bed, he paused for a moment. Looking out the window at the quiet city below, he felt a deep sense of peace. For years he had lived in the shadows, unseen and underestimated. But tonight he had stepped into the light, not just for himself, but for the boy who believed in him, and for everyone who had ever doubted or overlooked someone because of their appearance, their job, or their quiet life. He knew that life would continue to be challenging. There would still be struggles, still be hard days, still be moments when the world didn't recognize effort or talent. But tonight had proven something important, that courage, perseverance, and talent could shine through even in the most unlikely places. And he would carry that knowledge forward, quietly proud, quietly strong, and ready for whatever life might bring next. As he finally closed his eyes, the memory of the applause, the astonished faces, and the whispers of admiration filled his mind. He smiled, thinking of his son, thinking of the music, thinking of the courage it had taken to step forward and show the world who he truly was. And in that quiet apartment, surrounded by love and small comforts, he understood something deeply. The greatest victories are not always measured by fame or fortune, but by the strength to be yourself, to share your gift, and to inspire others without ever expecting recognition in return.